Hey, I'm sure you know that your immune system has a memory. So, for example, when you get a bacterial infection, when you're a child or even an adult, your immune system remembers that infection or the bacteria. And the next time that pathogen comes in, it can deal with it much, much faster. And so, did you also know that your cells can store memories inside them, just a regular cell? That's the big idea behind this interview and Dr. Thomas Verny's new book called The Embodied Mind. What he says is when our cells come together into tissues and organs and even the human body, it forms a collective intelligence that stores a memory inside it. So this is a very interesting interview. We, of course, discuss the memory stored inside cells. We discuss psychotherapy, and we also discuss the trauma that's passed down through generations through epigenetics and whatnot. So make sure to listen to this interview. It's really cool. Are you enjoying the shows on this channel? If you are, please make sure to hit the subscribe button down below so you can get notified when we release new episodes. Our goal with this channel is to give you practical tips that will help you slow down your aging and look and feel younger and sexier for much longer. So hit the subscribe button down below and let's get on with the show. Are you looking to get thicker, fuller, and longer hair? Then make sure to check out fullyvital.com. We've come up with multiple products that stimulate hair follicles in different ways to wake them up and start the regrowth process, but also to get you thicker and fuller hair quickly. So make sure to check out fullyvital.com for natural hair healthy products and use code anti-aging hacks for 15% off your order. Hello and welcome back to the Anti-Aging Hacks podcast. Today, my guest is Dr. Thomas Verny, who's a clinical psychiatrist, academic, and author of 8 books and 47 scientific papers, including The Secret Life of the Unborn Child, which was published in 27 countries. He has participated in more than 250 newspaper, radio, and TV interviews, including appearances with Donahue, Merv Griffin, Oprah, Barbara Walters, and Unsolved Mysteries. These interviews are available at trvernymd.com. He has taught at Harvard University, University of Toronto, York University, and St. Mary's, University of Minnesota. Dr. Verny lives with his wife in Ontario, Canada. His newest book is called The Embodied Mind and explores our body's ability to store memory in our cells, which is a fascinating topic, and I've been reading the book. I can't wait to dive into this interview. With that said, Dr. Verny, welcome to the Anti-Aging Hacks podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So we were talking a little bit about your background, which I find completely fascinating. So let's get into your background. Tell the listeners how you got into the field that you're in and how you decided to write a book about the body storing memories of all things.
Well, thank you for that question. It's a big question. Being a psychiatrist and having always been inside oriented, I guess I would have to say that it started with my birth, but considering that I'm 87 years old, it would take us a little while to cover that. So I'm going to skip a few years and I will go to the age 13. And at that time, I found myself in Vienna with my family. We emigrated from Czechoslovakia at that time. It was 1949. I was 13 years old. I did not speak any German. And in the flat that we rented, there was a bookcase. And on the bookcase, there was a book by Freud. And it was The Interpretation of Dreams. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how, but somehow I knew that Freud was famous. Like, I don't think I had an idea of who he was, but the name sounded somehow familiar. So I decided to read that book. I was somehow, attracted to it. And like I said, I didn't speak any German. I had a German Slovak dictionary. And with the dictionary in hand, I would start reading the book. Word for word, I would translate it. And as time went on, of course, I got better at it, and I continued reading the book, and it really spoke to me. I was very, very impressed by the way Freud took somebody's dream and then, working with the patient, discovered all kinds of underlying motivations in that person's life. So at that point, I made up my mind that I was going to become a psychiatrist. And then eventually we emigrated to Canada in 1952. We came to Toronto, my parents and I. I entered medical school at the University of Toronto, but there was a problem because the doctors who were sort of running at that time, the university, the medical faculty, many of them were doctors, medical doctors during the war, during the Second World War. And some of them took like a 6 months course in psychiatry and became quote unquote psychiatrists. Mm-hmm. And their attitude to psychiatry was abominable. I mean, their attitude was that all that psychiatrists really did was listen to rich old ladies complaining about their dachshunds. In other words, like, you know, this is not real medicine. This is not science. This is like nonsense. So I got a lot of that negative sort of information, sometimes straightforward, sometimes between the lines. And so that did not sound like, you know, a good career choice at that point. And so I decided to become an obstetrician instead. Mm-hmm. But I spent 1 month on the obstetrical wing of a large hospital, St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto. And I absolutely detested and was turned off by the way obstetricians treated women. We had a largely Italian population at that hospital, and they would yell at them, you know, just push. And like the whole delivery process was so inhuman as far as I was concerned. I delivered 27 babies, but it was very inhuman. It was very strange. It really turned me off. So that year, then, between the third and the fourth year of medicine, it's a 6-year course. Between the third and fourth year, fourth is being the last. There are 2 years of pre-meds and 4 years of medicine. So between the third and fourth year, I went as an extern, it was called, to a very large mental hospital, Middletown State Hospital in New York State. And they had 5,000 patients at that time. It was a huge wow. Hospital, but on very beautiful grounds because the patients kept the grounds very nicely. They were not unionized. And so when I came there, they had very few doctors. Like they had something like 30 doctors for 5,000 patients. And most of the doctors were foreign doctors who were essentially studying for their exams so that they should be able to become fully legitimate in the United States. So they would spend a few hours in the morning checking on medications of the patients. Then they would go back to their rooms and spend the rest of the day studying. So when I came, they asked me, where would you like to go? Because like there were so few doctors, you could do anything. And I said, I would like to go to the emergency ward where patients would first come in. And so that's fine. So I started working in the emergency department. I'm coming to the end very quickly. I started to work in the emergency department, and I knew very, very little psychiatry. I knew about diagnosis, depression, obsessive compulsive schizophrenia. And I knew the importance of taking a history, and I knew the importance of dreams. That's about it. Mm-hmm. So I started taking histories, And then it occurred to me that it would be important to talk to the families of these people. So I started calling in family members, and I started to talk to the patients about their experiences and about their dreams. Well, within about a week, there were these huge lineups of patients in front of my office because the word got around that there was a doctor here who actually spoke to you. So everybody wanted to speak to me, and my patients started to get better, to improve at a huge, much, much faster than any of the other patients of the other doctors. So when I saw this, when I saw how these really, really sick people, they were hallucinating, they were hearing voices, they were really sick, and they started getting better on very few medications. At that time, we had one medication, which was called Largactil. It was the first antipsychotic. With few medications, but with a little bit of human care, they started getting better. That's when I made up my mind that I would become a psychiatrist. So I went back to psychiatry, became a psychiatrist. That's how I started my career as a psychiatrist.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. There's so much to unpack there. As I was reading your book, I came across, and you were talking about delivering babies and how that was traumatic experience. So one of the things that I've been personally wondering about for many, many years is the concept or the idea of transgenerational inheritance, that the circumstances of your parents' life or your grandparents or even above for multiple generations can get passed down to you through epigenetics. And for a lot of us, right, our parents didn't have the best lives, and there was scarcity of resources, of money, there was hardships, and so that certainly almost gets passed down. In addition, you talk about nicotine, cannabis, alcohol use as things that also are adverse for neurodevelopment outcomes in offspring as well. So I want you to talk about what you discovered and why this is so important, that for us to truly live the lives free of these generational traumas, we have to go back and analyze what came down and be able to fix that.
Yeah, I'm sorry about this. It will stop in a second. It stopped. Good.
Okay.
Well, there is a great deal of research, which I refer to in my book, to show that certainly stress, for example, during pregnancy, but even stress, let's say, in fathers before conception, before the baby is ever conceived, stress in the father or mother, smoking nicotine, you mentioned, in the father, there's some very good research on that. There is research on future fathers, in other words, before conception, being put down, being criticized, feeling low, in other words, having their self-esteem attacked. All those things are transferred at the time of conception by the way of genes and what's called microRNAs and cellular vesicles and all kinds of other structures that we don't need to go into. But the fact is that much of that is transferred to the future baby. So that baby then, when it's born and grows up, is going to carry marks of those experiences. Now, of course, a lot is going to depend on all the experiences that that child is exposed to from conception on, because everything that happens to the mother, of course, is also transferred the child that she's carrying. And of course, the birth and events after the birth, all of those things are going to affect the expression of genes, which is where epigenetics comes in, the expression of genes in that child, and consequently its personality, its immune system, health, all those things are going to be affected by this long line of previous events. So the important thing, the simplest way of putting it is that everything is connected, that everything that has happened to your parents and to their parents and then to you, it's all connected. Just like the brain is connected to the body is connected to the brain. So everything that has happened in your life has had an impact on you, and everything that has happened to your parents before they conceived you, and to the mother, and sometimes the father while they are pregnant with you, all of those things are going to affect you. So it's very, very important. It's very important to find out, about your roots, because sometimes when you do that, some questions about yourself will be answered just by realizing where you come from, so to speak, There is some wonderful research that shows that even into the fourth generation, baby, I think it was rats, and rats are very similar, by the way, to humans in terms of genetics. Even into the fourth generation, rats were affected by what happened 4 generations ago to their parents.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's wild. And one of the things you mentioned in your book is that if your parents or your mother during pregnancy experienced trauma,
yes,
then you as a child throughout your life would be more sensitive to trauma than somebody else that didn't have that during pregnancy. Their mothers didn't have that, for example.
Absolutely. What we have to realize is that people for a long time kind of went around saying, stress builds character. Well, maybe, but at the same time, it makes you weaker in terms of your body, in terms of your health, okay? It's like having a broken leg. It may heal and doesn't show on the outside that you had a broken bone, but that bone is not as strong now after it had been broken and it healed. It's not as strong as it was before the accident. And it's the same thing with stress. We are learning, stress is so toxic, and yet, we are all surrounded by it day and night. And, I on my podcast, I also have a podcast like you do, Pushing Boundaries with Dr. Dr Verny. And I was interviewing a fantastic professor, Professor Steve Cole, from the University of California. And he has done a great deal of research on inflammation. And it has been shown that inflammation is probably the main cause of cancer. It's the main cause of atherosclerosis. It has a huge negative effect on the immune system. Inflammation and depression go hand in hand. Inflammation and Alzheimer's disease go hand in hand. So anybody who listens to this podcast should realize that the importance of getting rid of any chronic inflammation, or acute inflammation, if you possibly can. Mm-hmm. Okay, get it cured, get it healed, do whatever it needs to be done to get rid of chronic inflammation, because it's a killer.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. There is a test available that I recommend people get every year. It's called the CRP, C-reactive protein, or the high sensitivity C-reactive protein, which you can get. It's a marker for general inflammation, general chronic inflammation in your body. It doesn't measure everything perfectly, because let's say you have a local inflammation somewhere, it may not show up in the HACRP test. So
Right.
there's more tests people can do, but we can talk about that later. What I want to get to
Okay.
is the next aspect that I want to touch on, Dr. Verny, is the fact that the cells are storing memory. And this is
Yes.
fascinating because the first time I heard about this was in Ayurveda. An Ayurvedic practitioner told me that your cells remember. And that made no sense to me at the time. I'm like, what is this gobbledygook this person's talking about? So, but I'm coming into more and more contact with people and views of that similar nature. And so I want to talk to you about how it is that cells are able to remember things going back as far as when we were conceived.
Yeah, that's a very central and important question. You know, cells are truly incredible machines. The only cell that is visible to the naked eye is the ovum, is the egg cell. All other cells are so small, you can't see them with the naked eye. And yet these cells are incredibly complicated and consist of an incredible number of different parts. And so people who have studied cells tell us, that of course in the nucleus there is the DNA, which is the genes that, the genome that we carry. And cells communicate with other cells, just like neurons communicate with other neurons, in a very, very similar fashion. And cells have many parts that are, for example, the cell membrane, which is considered by many scientists as sort of being the cell's brain. Like for a long time, people thought of the nucleus as the brain of the cell. But more and more people, Bruce Lipton, perhaps, who you may have heard of, yes, believe that it's the cell membrane is really sort of the thinking part of the cell, if you can put it that way. Anyway, there has been research done on the fact that cells actually remember, quote unquote, remember their origins. And I have, I think in my book, I refer to that. I refer to that, a very recent study. If it's not in the book, then I have it somewhere else. But cells are able to remember their origins, and cells are very, very good. Like the whole idea of using cells, for example, as computers is becoming very, very current. The fact, what really got me interested in this was that about 8 years ago, I guess now it is, I was reading in one of the medical journals about a 44-year-old Frenchman who went to see his doctor because of a weakness in his left leg. And so the doctor did, the usual number of studies, checking the blood, x-rays, etc. They also did an x-ray of his head. And to everyone's surprise, they found that the man had virtually no brain. And his skull was filled with fluid, cerebrospinal fluid, which is in medical terminology is called hydrocephalus, water on the brain. He only had a thin crust of cerebral tissue in his skull. Yet he was a married man with 2 children and working successfully in the French civil service.
Wow.
He seemed perfectly normal. And I thought to myself, how is this possible? Like, this makes no sense. The man has no brain. How can he be normal? And so it was that kind of propelled me into this whole area of the embodied mind, because I started looking into the medical literature, and I found actually quite a number of studies that looked at people who have had epilepsy, for example, or children, especially children, who have had very, very unresponsive to medications, epileptic seizures. And the only way that they could cure them was to remove surgically large parts of their brain. And yet the study showed that many of these children, not all of them, but the great majority, continued to be quite responsive, quite intelligent. There seemed to be no lack of brain power, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And so again, I thought, well, this kind of goes with the French civil servant. And it was those experiences and those studies that persuaded me that just like, your computer has got some kind of a backup system, whether it's in the cloud or on a hard drive or whatever, so the brain must have a backup system, which must be the rest of the body. So all the cells in the body must contribute to our ability to think and to plan and all the other things that we do with our brain. And so that led me to investigate the possibility that the brain and the rest of the body are connected, and they really work as one. And if there is a problem in one part, some of the other parts take over and will still provide good service to the person.
Yeah, this is so interesting. And when it comes to deciding which memories the brain or even the body is going to store, by the way, I've heard of this, people talking about the body always keeps score. Yeah. Issues are in your tissues, right? These things, words people use, metaphors.
Yes.
And so how does the brain and body decide which information or memory is worthy of being stored? Is it that there's a high emotional charge or a trauma, either negative or positive, that's associated with it, and that's what gets stored?
That's a wonderful question. I think that you put your finger on it. I think the emotional valence that memory carries is very, very important. And how that is inscribed or coded in our system, I don't know. I don't know at the moment. Nobody does. Nobody does. All we know is that it happens, which is the first step. We know it happens. We know also that it's very subjective, like what may be important to you may not be important to me. Speaking in public will create stress in some people, and for other people, it energizes them. So all of these experiences are very subjective. But if you have a traumatic experience, if you see, let's say, a car accident in front of your house, it may have more significance if it's in front of your house, for example, than if you see it, I don't know, at the supermarket. Mm-hmm. So, your own personal experiences play a huge role in terms of what you will remember and what you will forget. But how that happens, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me ask you about, there's the individual cell that's storing some sort of memory, as we know, the body is storing it. But you also talk about in your book the importance of the network of cells, which kind of form a collective intelligence, so to speak. Yes. What's the significance of that?
Well, I think it's just like in computers. It's each individual cell is just part of the whole system, right? And just like individual bacteria are nothing, but when you have millions of them, and very often they can form like a film, for example, then they start acting as a larger organism. I mean, this is how evolution actually works. You start with like an incredibly simple cell billions of years ago, and gradually the cells become more and more attached to each other. They form networks. Before you know it, they start specializing. The one in a certain area becomes more specialized in terms of eating, another area perhaps in terms of propagation, and before you know it, you have some kind of an animal. Well, before you know it, a few trillion years later. But so it's the same thing with cells. Each individual cell contributes a micro bit of memory. But when they are all connected, and we have billions of cells, so when they are all connected, they work as a network, as you rightly said. And as a network, they are incredibly strong. By themselves, they are nothing. But as a network, they become very, very efficient.
Mm-hmm. And so this network could be just a collection. I guess at the smallest level, there's a cell. Then there's a network called kidney cells, for example, right? Liver
or
cells.
Tissue.
Or tissue.
And then
that makes the organ, right? Which makes the organism, right? So at every level, there's higher levels of intelligence and more coordination available to this thing that now is becoming more and more alive. Is that where consciousness comes from?
Well, you're hitting all the high points. Consciousness is a huge problem. Would be interesting to have a look and see how many books have been written on consciousness, but there must be hundreds. There must be at least 200 books on consciousness, and God knows how many papers and articles on consciousness. Everybody is trying to, get hold of a definition of consciousness. And my understanding of consciousness, and I'm not saying that it's the best, or I'm not saying that it's the only one, but based on 7 years of working on this book, and God knows how many years of psychiatric practice, too many to count now, I feel that consciousness is part of the embodied mind. In the past, and if you will speak to sort of middle of the way scientists, neuroscientists, if you will speak to neuroscientists who are sort of classically trained and continue to read other classical neuroscientists and speak to other classical neuroscientists, they consider consciousness an epiphenomenon of the brain, which in simple language means that it is a function of the brain. Epiphenomenon means a function. Mm-hmm. So just like, for example, urine is a function of the kidneys, consciousness is a function of the brain. Now, of course, the moment I say this, it already starts sounding like nonsense, because surely consciousness cannot be equated with urine. So, urine is something material that you can see, make experiments with, etc., etc. Consciousness, you can't get hold of, right? You don't see it. It's just an idea, really. It's non-material. So how can a material thing like the brain, which is material, or the body, produce something that is non-material? There's a problem here, right? There's a problem. So I think, having given it much thought, and like I say, there are many different ways of looking at this, but if you ask me, the way I look upon it is that consciousness is definitely produced by the whole body, But it may be more than that. It may be more than that, because it may be part of a much larger consciousness residing in the universe.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a number of people who are much smarter than I am, who hold that consciousness is one of the original what's the word, original materials or original contents of the universe. Like it is thought that energy and consciousness were the first things that existed in our universe, and that materials like chemicals and things that we can touch and see were actually produced by consciousness instead of the other way around. Okay, so we are getting into highly philosophical and technical areas, like I said, which is not something that I'm that familiar with. But I do believe that consciousness is on a higher level of scientific inquiry, if you like, than just materialism, which is all about the brain and all about, essentially, it's Newtonian science. And I think that as we move more and more into the quantum realm of science, we are becoming more and more aware that materialism and determinism are not the full answer to our questions about who we are and what is being human really means.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Okay, so let me bring it back to something that I think possibly the most important question of this interview is that if we think about the brain and the body connection as like a response or a memory of something that's happened in the past, there is a breakage in the body or a tear, you heal it, you remember it. There's a psychological trauma, you remember in your body and your brain. Now, how can we reprogram our mind and our body with new thoughts, feelings, emotions, and new future that has not existed or happened yet? But by thinking about it over and over and reprogramming with strong emotion, we can kind of store a memory of that into the body, thereby making it much easier or likely for us to achieve that. Is that something you entertain or think about?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think, I think that's the idea behind all sort of insight-oriented psychotherapy. And it is why I decry, why I am upset and saddened by so many psychiatrists sort of, going to the dark side and just handing out drugs instead of really talking to people about their problems. Because I do believe that, and I have seen it, it's not just a question of belief, but I have witnessed it as sure as I'm sure you have, that, talking to someone and reaching a deeper level of understanding of the problem, whether it's a relationship problem or whether it's, something in me that, whatever it is that's making me depressed or making me obsessive compulsive, if you're able to understand that, and that has to happen, on both intellectual and emotional level. That's very important, because remember we talked about how memories with an emotional valence are remembered so much better. So it's the same thing with psychotherapy. Intellectual insights without emotions are useless.
Wow.
Just useless. They have no impact. What your body brain says is, oh, that's interesting. Okay, so what are we having for dinner?
You're right.
It does not have an impact. It has to happen on an emotional level. If I see one of my patients suddenly starting to cry or to laugh uncontrollably, I know that, we have hit pay dirt.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it has to happen on an emotional level. And so I think that when that happens, then you are able to change. And that's why it's important to do it with a person instead of, let's say, reading a book. Like a lot of people with emotional problems read one book after another, trying to find sort of the answers in a book. And you can't. I mean, not in terms of personality change. I mean, like I say, it may be interesting from an academic standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
But, I would like people, if they, for example, read my book and something really strikes them as important to them, to discuss it with another person, because that will then really take hold of you if you can do that, instead of just keeping it sort of to yourself and saying, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, good. Okay, let's move on. So yes, I think the answer to your question, which really was more of a comment than a question, because you had the answer in your question. Yes, emotionally important, subjectively important, introspection is very, very healthy. And I believe, it's really the only way that people can dramatically change for the better.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We're coming up on time, so just a couple of quick questions.
Sure.
One would be, in your book, you mentioned that because the memories are stored in the cells, they're stored in the body. Therefore, a somatic therapy or a psychosomatic therapy that deals with the body and the emotions in it and helps release it would be quite effective at getting rid of these. So, and you mentioned a few of the therapies that people can can do.
Yeah,
so,
right.
Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. Yeah. I think that because talking is not everyone's way of communicating in a significant way. Some people are not good at communicating verbally. Some doctors are not very good at communicating with their patients verbally. On the other hand, when you work with the body, you don't need to speak, and the body will speak for itself.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a lot of traumas, not all of them, but there are a lot of traumas which really are preserved in the body, particularly if the trauma involved the body. I mean, if somebody, hit you, or if you were in a car accident, or if your mother, for example, tried to abort you while she was pregnant with you, any of these kinds of things which would have had an impact on the body can be worked with very well through the body. So anyone who has had those kinds of experiences will probably benefit from what's often referred to as body work, which can take many, many different expressions. There's Reiki, there is, massage therapy. There are all kinds of therapeutic methods that can help you. And once again, I think it's important to keep in mind that not everybody can benefit from one type. Any therapist who tells you that I can cure you or I can heal your whatever ails you for certain, well, just don't believe that. Okay. There's no such a thing as one therapy works for everyone. It just is not true. Just like one drug does not work for everyone. It's not that there's something wrong with the therapist. It's just that people are so different that you sometimes you just have to experiment. So in terms of people who are listening to us, I would say, if you don't benefit from 5 or 6 sessions, whoever you are seeing right away, move on, find somebody else. I remember, I can think of so many of my previous patients, who came to me after they had seen someone else who promised them that in 3 sessions, I'll get rid of your depression. I mean, that's just nonsense.
Right, right.
Okay, nobody can do that,
Yeah.
But by the same token, I would never assume that I can help everyone. Some people I can help and others I can't. And if I can help them, and if I see that for some reason, we are not on the same communication level, I will refer them to somebody else who I think might be able to help them more. So in terms of the body question, the body armor, trying to get through the body armor is very, very important, and it works wonderfully for some people, and it's definitely worth a try.
Okay, fantastic. And if they don't see a response or a change in 5 or 6 treatments, do they change the therapist or do they change the therapy?
Well, I think when you change the therapist, you probably change the therapy.
Okay.
Because each therapist has their own way of doing things, even if they say that they are a Jungian or they're a Freudian or whatever they are. Each person, I mean, the thing about therapy is that it is very, very personalized. I mean, I remember I had sometimes people training with me to become therapists, and they would try to imitate sort of what I did, and it just didn't work for them. It was not them, it was like wearing somebody else's clothes. It just didn't fit them. You have to find your own way, things that are expressions of your own personality. But I think the most important thing in terms of therapists, the kind of person that I would look for is a person who really cares about their patients, therapists for whom you're not a number or just a name or a depression or an obsessive compulsive problem, but a person. And if you can get a therapist like that with whom you can communicate and feel comfortable with, then stick to that person.
Okay, wonderful. I believe that everybody should take on some form of therapy. There's a lot of wounds that most of us have, traumas. And if you're not examining your life and moving forward with clearing out some of the old baggage that you're carrying, not just personally, but also generationally, then you're not going to be able to live a maximally fulfilled life. That's my personal opinion. But so where...
Amen to that. Yes.
Okay. Dr. Verny, tell us about your book again. Tell us about your podcast and where people can find you.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you to ask. My book is called The Embodied Mind, which means that the mind is part of the whole body instead of just the brain. My podcasts are called Pushing Boundaries with Dr. Thomas R. Verny, and they are available on all the usual what do you call them? Yeah, platforms. Yeah. That's it. Thank you. On all the usual platforms. I also have a blog on Psychology Today, which is very popular. I usually put in a blog every 2 or 3 weeks on Psychology Today. To my amazement, during the last year, 220,000 people have downloaded that.
Wow.
So it seems to be fairly popular. So those are some of the things that I do. The Embodied Mind is coming out in paperback in June. So it will be available in paperback. And generally speaking, it seems to be well received. It's being published now in Russia, in Greece, in Brazil, in Czechia. I think, about 5 countries, I think, so far. And Spain. Yes, in Spain. So it will be in Portuguese and Spanish and Russian and Czech and Greek so far.
Yeah, beautiful. That's very well deserved. I think the book is fantastic. I've been reading it, like I said, and I will keep referring to it over and over again. So thank you for coming on the Anti-Aging Hacks podcast, Dr. Verny.
My pleasure, truly.